My name is Sharon Wiggins, and I've served 18 and a half years of a life sentence, having a life sentence in Pennsylvania. For the majority of lifers has become real frustrating. When other inmates or lifers who come to you and say, well, why should I try? You know, nobody's ever going to listen. Nobody's ever going to let you out. At first, that was a hard question for me to answer, especially after I had preached for so long and said, well, you know, if you do the right things, then eventually somebody will see. And now it's, I run across a situation where people say to me, you've done everything, and nobody's still listening. I have to let them know that there is some personal satisfaction in looking back at myself and seeing myself now. There is some pride in the things that I've done for myself, and I hope that eventually one day that somebody will notice, and I have to live with that.
That was a clip from a documentary titled Voices from the Inside. It was produced by the Pennsylvania Prison Society in 1988, which featured Sharon, aka Peachy Wiggins, at the State Correctional Institution at Muncie in Muncie, Pennsylvania. If anyone is interested, I will share the link if you would like to view that documentary. I wanted to share this story because it was sort of left in the dark. I kind of had to dig in the crates, and it felt like it was swept away in the archive. So I had to dig in the crates. I had to dig in the archives. And it's also the kind of story that raises a lot of questions and evokes dialogue around the justice system, human rights, societal issues, and what rehabilitation truly means. Real quick, please keep in mind that outside of the facts that I will be presenting in this video surrounding this story, I will also be sharing my opinions as well. Okay? Sharon was the longest incarcerated female serving juvenile life without the possibility of parole in the world. This is what makes her story unique. Okay? I'm objective with this. I am reporting on this from a completely objective place, but I also will be sharing some opinions as well around this. So before we get into the Sharon Wiggins story, I'm going to go over some quick demographic background information on her. Sharon was born on February 15th, 1951 in the Hill District of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This is a historically and predominantly Black neighborhood. There's not too much information on any of her family members or relatives other than her mother, who ended up moving to Detroit, and her sister that she speaks very fondly of in her interviews. She is now also a resident in Detroit, Michigan. Sharon was interviewed periodically throughout her sentence, right? So you would have journalists, news reporters, juvenile justice advocates. They would go up there to Muncie Prison, upstate Pennsylvania, and visit Sharon and have a conversation with her, ask her questions about her experience as a juvenile lifer. So you pretty much just have to rely on the information that they presented, right? So how did Sharon end up in prison with a life sentence at 17 years old? Well, on December 2nd, 1968, 17-year-old Sharon and two teenage Black males, Foster Tarver, 17, and Samuel Barlow, 18, decided to drive from Pittsburgh to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, to rob the Dolphin Deposit Bank. When they arrived at the bank, Samuel stayed outside in a stolen getaway car, while Sharon and Foster went inside the bank. Now, they said that Sharon stood by the bank's entrance and she hid behind a tall plant. I'm guessing, just to conceal herself, or if anything goes awry, she had a clean break, a clean getaway. She could just skate out. I'm guessing that's why she hid behind the plant, while Foster was closer to the bank tellers. So he was deeper in the bank, right? That's when a 64-year-old white male, George Morlock, a retired truck driver, and a customer of the bank, entered the bank and noticed that a robbery was in progress. What he did, he confronted Sharon and he started tussling with her, right? In an attempt to disarm her. During this struggle, her gun goes off twice, hitting George Morlock. That's when Foster ran over to where Sharon and George Morlock were at, where they were wrestling, and Foster shot him again, ultimately unaliving George Morlock. In total, he was shot 6 times based on the news report at that time. So unfortunately, George Morlock lost his life that day in the bank. At that point, Sharon and Foster, they flee the bank. They hop in the getaway car, but they are quickly apprehended by police because, again, we're dealing with teenagers. We're not dealing with seasoned criminals. I believe, it's my opinion, that that's why they were quickly apprehended by police. They didn't even make it out the city of Harrisburg. Now, remember, this was 1968, right? No social media. So George Morlock, the victim in this case, him attempting to stop a robbery, to stop the holdup, it brought to mind the stark contrast between then and now as far as the bystander effect, right? As far as the bystander effect, where people just stand around while a crime is being committed, where people just stand there and take out their phone, they start recording someone being violated. So that was very interesting. Just, stumbling upon that part of this story, it just brought that to my mind, the bystander effect. So that was very interesting. But at any rate, Sharon ended up pleading guilty to first-degree murder, and all 3 teens were eventually sentenced to death. Sharon was sent to SCI Muncie, a maximum security women's prison. At that time, she was the only female in the prison with a death sentence, 17 years old. So technically, there wasn't a death row because of that. So she was placed in a restricted housing unit. After 2 years in that restricted housing unit, with the help of the NAACP, her death sentence was commuted to mandatory life without the possibility of parole. All of them, not just Sharon, but her co-defendants as well. But because this is about Sharon Wiggins, aka Peachy, I'm really not going to speak on her co-defendants because they were able to make it out of the prison alive, right? I believe Sharon at that time may have felt somewhat relieved, because, who wouldn't want a life sentence instead of a death sentence, I believe she felt somewhat relieved, but then she eventually, as time went on, she found out that that was just the lesser of 2 evils, per se, to her. Here's another interesting fact while researching this story. Muncie Prison at that time did not have any fence walls or barbed wire fences. There were no barriers at this prison. So Sharon and the other inmates, they would just casually walk off the premises. They would walk off the prison grounds. They would then get put on escape status. They would get caught. Some of them had to get caught and then returned back to prison. Some of them would just turn themselves back in. Sharon walked away twice during that time. This was a long time ago, right? Remember, this is way back. So she turned herself in on that last occasion. And so I thought that was also a remarkable, notable fact about this case. I may have done the same thing, right? I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but if I was told that I had a mandatory life sentence without the possibility, that means I can't keep hope alive. Without the possibility of parole at 17 years old, all I had to do was wait until one of the COs turned their back. I probably would have done the same thing, just keeping it 100. Probably would have done the same thing. Now, this is not an issue of whether or not Sharon should have been held accountable for her actions, because yes, she absolutely should have been held accountable for her actions because someone lost their life. This man lost his life, right? Trying to prevent a robbery. And he had family that loved him and cared about him, right? So she should have been held accountable, and she was. She was held accountable. And according to interviews from other women who had did time with her, as well as juvenile justice advocates who visited her throughout her sentence, this woman did 45 years in prison, right? She was genuinely remorseful for George Morlock's death. She understood that she made a terrible, impulsive decision that ended someone's life. And she expressed this numerous times, not only to George Morlock's family, but also to the Pennsylvania Board of Pardons, right? Sharon gave the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and society 45 years of her life for a terrible decision she made at 17 years old. So I'm wondering, how do we measure accountability? How do you measure that? Is there a threshold? Do we go off the victim's age at the time of their demise? How do we measure it? That's the question that I have. Sharon pretty much grew up in prison, right? And it sounds like she made the best of it. Sharon earned a degree from Penn State University. She took advantage of the undergraduate educational program while she was there. She earned over 10,000 certificates in any and everything that you can think of, right? Cosmetology, photography, mechanics, you name it. She also tutored other inmates and she helped them earn their GEDs. She even spoke up about younger women who were being raped by prison guards. To me, this is the most important thing that she did. Yes, everything else, all of it is important. This part right there, Sharon speaking up about younger women who are being raped by prison guards, that to me was extremely courageous. Risky, definitely risky, but courageous nonetheless, right? There's also archived articles where the women that did time with her, they had the opportunity to share what they thought and felt about Sharon. None of those women had anything negative to say about her. I'm talking other Black women, white women, Hispanic women, different ethnicities, all of the above. All of them seemed very fond of Sharon, right? These women, they did time together. We're not talking 2, 3, 5, 10 years. We're talking decades. These women loved Sharon. They expressed the genuine love they had for her and the respect for her, and they were deeply saddened by her death and how she wasn't given a chance, an opportunity to give back to the outside. Sharon applied for clemency 13 times and was rejected 13 times. The last time Sharon applied for clemency was in 2011. You have the Juvenile Law Center, the Defender Association of Philadelphia, Temple University Beasley School of Law, Boston School of Law, University of San Francisco School of Law, all of these schools, all of these entities in collaboration fighting for Sharon's release. They filed an appeal in the Pennsylvania Superior Court on behalf of Sharon, who was 60 years old at that time, right? They argued that it was unconstitutional to sentence a juvenile to a mandatory sentence of life without parole because based on scientific research, juveniles have a greater capacity for rehabilitation than adults. And that's because the part of the brain responsible for reasoning, making decisions, understanding consequences does not fully develop until around the age of 25. I think that was some pretty solid evidence, if you ask me, coming from scientists, right? Coming from experts. It don't get no better than that. However, they still denied Sharon's appeal for clemency with the scientific facts presented. Now, at that point, the Juvenile Law Center appealed again, but this time to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And that was also denied. And then they advised Sharon of her right to appeal, and that was Sharon's last time applying for clemency. That was her very last time in 2011. 60-year-old woman. Their reason for rejecting 60-year-old Sharon's appeal was that her appeal for relief was untimely. Their decision was that her appeal was untimely. So, after that final attempt at freedom, on June 25th, 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court, based on a landmark ruling, Miller versus Alabama, ruled that sentencing juveniles to mandatory life without parole is cruel, inhumane, and unconstitutional. So what did that mean for Sharon? 9 months later, while waiting to be resentenced under this new law, Sharon died on March 24th, 2013, just 9 months later, after the law was reversed, stating that juveniles sentenced to mandatory life without parole is cruel, inhumane, and unconstitutional because at that age, their brain was not fully developed, right? So she died on March 24th, 2013 from heart failure in her prison cell. In her prison cell. You know what? I wonder, after just, doing all of the research that I did on this case, I wonder if her being rejected for clemency all of those times, those 13 times, I wonder if it had anything to do with her speaking up on behalf of the younger women in the prison up there in Muncie who were being raped by prison guards, because none of the prison guards, the warden, none of the other staff members, none of them mentioned any issues that they had with Sharon, And according to the Department of Corrections, she was a model prisoner. She was a model prisoner according to the Department of Corrections. This woman was undoubtedly rehabilitated. Undoubtedly. So when we talk about issues around human rights and justice and rehabilitation, isn't mercy supposed to be included in that? Right? Since wanting mercy is a part of our human nature, then offering mercy is also a part of human nature, right? I would think. And again, she has displayed genuine remorse for that 64-year-old man, George Morlock, losing his life, and which would cause grief and pain to his family, to his survivors. She did express that. And she was held accountable, right? So, that's very interesting. That is 9 months after the law was reversed, Sharon ended up dying in her prison cell. Very unfortunate. There were 2 women that deserve flowers. Oh, absolutely. As it relates to Sharon's story, because they were instrumental in Sharon's life. They really were. And fought tirelessly for Sharon's release from prison of not only Sharon, but other women as well. Mary DeWitt and Ellen Maldonado. Both of these women were official visitors with the Pennsylvania Prison Society. Mary DeWitt taught art at Muncie. She taught art, and she helped the women use art to manage their thoughts and release their emotions. She also offered them a healthy, positive outlet to express their grief and anguish through art. Any emotion that they experienced. She taught them to use art as the outlet to do so, which is very important because that in prisons, in the prison system, even if you're defending yourself in an attack, you still have to be reprimanded in some way. You're still going to be punished, even if you're defending yourself. So the fact that she taught art and taught these women how to use art as an outlet to deal with their emotions. Very important and very appreciated. Very much so appreciated. Ellen Maldonado, she was an official visitor with the Pennsylvania Prison Society, and she started writing letters to Sharon and visiting her and supporting Sharon in any way that Sharon needed. Remember, the only person outside of these women connected to Sharon was her sister. So essentially, Sharon only had 3 people visiting her. Her sister when she could. Remember, Sharon was locked up in PA, in Pennsylvania. Sharon's family, the only family that she had, ended up relocating to Detroit, Michigan, right? So she really only had visits from Mary and Ellen because they were in Pennsylvania, right? So again, outside of her sister who lived in Detroit for a significant portion of Sharon's sentence, these were the only women who visited Sharon in the 45 years that she did, 45 years that she did in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections State Correctional Institution at Muncie. Ellen also raised over $4,000 to help Sharon's sister with the funeral expenses, which also included sending Sharon's body to Detroit because that's where her surviving family members lived at, right? This also speaks to the number of women who receive fewer visits than men, which is a proven fact. Women in prison have been dubbed the forgotten population. Forgotten by the DOC, Department of Corrections, and forgotten by people on the outside. People on the outside who proclaim their love for them. You know, these women's husbands, women's the father of their children, boyfriends, whoever, you know, they have been dubbed the forgotten populations. And that is because a part of that is because prisons were designed with men in mind, with men. So women often have less access to medical treatment, other programs, other services that are tailored to women's health. Because again, prisons were designed with men in mind, right? And I can personally attest to this. You know, when I have visited men in prison, when I have visited men's prisons, the visiting room is filled with women and children, right? When you visit women in prison, I have visited women's prisons, it's empty. And I think it's because women are more relationship oriented than men, and we are conditioned to care for and nurture everyone first, sometimes to a fault, oftentimes, not sometimes, oftentimes to a fault. You know, it was also noted that Sharon already had a heart attack before in the past and that she suffered from stomach ulcers, which I understand that to be likely stemmed from extra cortisol in the body stemming from stress. So that's not surprising. You know, we know that prison food is unhealthy. There's no fresh fruits and vegetables. The food is highly processed. Mostly bad carbs, which ultimately lead to diabetes and other health issues. And I do think an unhealthy diet did contribute to Sharon's, poor health or heart failing. But in my opinion, I believe she also suffered from poor emotional health. Despite all of her accomplishments and efforts to live a semblance of a normal life, I believe that Sharon suffered from an overwhelming weight of emptiness that manifested physically, causing her to have a massive heart attack. Sharon died from a broken heart. I'm standing on that. That's what I believe. I believe that Sharon died from a broken heart. She was heartbroken. I believe she suffered from a sense of loss for the woman that she could have been had she not made that impulsive, fateful decision as a teenager. And I also believe that she suffered from a sense of loss for the future she imagined, had she been given the opportunity to experience life outside of prison walls. You know, very sad for everyone involved. Very sad for the victim, George Morlock, and his family, and also for these teenagers. There's no win. Nobody won. Here's something else to consider. Sharon's childhood was during the Jim Crow era, right? And at 17, when she decided to go along with her co-defendants to rob that bank out in Harrisburg, society was fresh out of the Jim Crow era. So she mostly lived her childhood in poverty. This is reported. This is not opinion. This is what I have found. These are facts. Sharon mostly lived her life in poverty during her childhood. And as a sidebar, for anyone who has experienced poverty in any shape, way, or form, it makes you more vulnerable to neglect and abuse. We know that in many cases, financial stress is linked to domestic violence because the caregivers are oftentimes overwhelmed with the demands of poverty and lack of resources, right? We also know that poverty limits opportunities for quality education, quality employment, and personal growth, among other things. So, all of those, in my opinion, are contributing factors to the decision Sharon made at 17 years old, which resulted in her spending 2 years on death row and having her sentence commuted to life without the possibility of parole. What's wild about this is the Department of Corrections, they basically sang her praises for being a model prisoner, right? And for her having a positive impact on other inmates. But they would not let her go. They would not let her go. Sharon literally changed. She literally changed. She matured, and she had gained an understanding that only adulthood offers. This is why they changed the law. This is why that Miller versus Alabama landmark ruling, this is why it's stated, that juveniles and children, they're not capable of making decisions that should warrant life in prison or death in prison. This is why they ruled it cruel, inhumane behavior, cruel and inhumane punishment. Because again, before the brain fully develops before 25, you don't understand the consequences of your actions, right? Among other things. So Sharon, she literally was not the same person. She was no longer that 17-year-old girl when she was first sentenced. And again, she did express remorse and guilt the whole entire time that she was in prison up there in Muncie. She did, and she was genuine about what happened to Mr. George Morlock. She was genuinely remorseful for it, but yeah, so-called justice system, what they do is they cherry pick certain scientific information, they accept certain information, and they reject certain information. So they cherry pick what they want to when it's time for them to make a ruling, when it's time to make a decision. So if you enjoyed this video, please do not forget to like and subscribe for more raw, uncut content. Until next time.